Welcome to the Earthen Grove, a gathering place to wander the intricacies of nature while foraging connections from our minds and bodies to the ecosystems around us. I'm herbal practitioner Austin Seibelts, and I'm happy to be joining you today as we explore the Grove. Welcome back to the Earthen Grove. Today we'll be turning away from our urban centers like we've been discussing in the past couple episodes and stepping out into nature to discuss deepening our connections with our ecosystems through foraging of medicines and foods, while also serving and revering the organisms that we work with. Foraging is one of my ultimate favorite pastimes, just exploring and letting the mind go curious about all the species around you, all the different types of interactions that they're having with other species, and learning about how we can work with these species in our culinary settings and in medicine making. Before we dive into the subject, though, there's a bit of some housekeeping that I have to do here. Firstly, I'm not a doctor. Anything that I say about different species that you can work with internally or externally in your body should be researched further. Another thing about research in this particular domain is that there's so many different types of organisms out there. I encourage you find a few that really resonate with you and do the deep research yourself there. I'll give you the starting grounds, the kind of basis of how you can begin doing this as we dive into the subject. But just remember, each species is a little bit different and has unique needs of their own kind. Remember always that you are working with living beings, and living beings can and do push back when they're threatened, and plants and fungi are obviously no exception here. There's a very common biochemical category known as alkaloids that can either act as medicine in some cases, such as in californidine in California poppy. In other cases, they can act as neurotoxins, such as in the case of conine in poison hemlock. What I'd recommend to any forager is that if you're getting into this, you need to have some kind of reference, some kind of resource guide of plants that are toxic in your general region. An easy way to do this would be through going online and researching different kinds of toxic plants and mushrooms that grow around your general area, and then putting together a short little document with descriptors and images of these organisms so that you can take that out into the field with you and have a little bit more reassurance that the plant that you're gathering from isn't one of these. On the note of identification, we'll dive more into how to identify plants and different methods that will ensure yourself to feel a little bit more confident here. But always be sure that whatever you're foraging from, you know what organism that is before you put it on your body, before you put it into your body. Even if a plant isn't generally considered toxic, there might be certain sensitivities that you have to its chemistry. For instance, if you're allergic to daisies, there's a very good chance that you might be allergic to the widespread Asteraceae family, which contains plants like Artemisia vulgaris, mugwort, or Achille millefolium, yarrow. When you're connecting with an organism that you've never worked with before, start slowly, start gently, so that your body doesn't become overwhelmed by something that it might have never come in contact with before. And then the other thing to consider here is to be aware of the surrounding environment. Are there potential toxins nearby, such as roads, runoff from houses, or trash or decaying machinery, or maybe you're near a processing plant of some kind? And beyond just what kind of toxins might be in the soil around you, how will foraging this organism affect that environment itself? There's a lot of different ways that you can forage for plants that will limit your footprint or even actually support the nearby ecosystem. When it comes to initially connecting with another organism for this purpose, it's important to remember to start small and to start slowly. Don't overwhelm yourself. If you're new to foraging in general, start with a few herbs or even just one herb at a time that you learn about. In fact, actually, herbal practitioner Sage Popham recommends studying only one plant per month and learning the different ways to how to deeply connect with it and work with it in your own life, rather than diving headfirst into a whole forest at the same time. Personally, the way that I work is through a few plants and mushrooms at a time, and this is especially the case if they happen to all ripen around the same season. For me, I like to work with different herbal formulas and also different propagation techniques, so it becomes a lot more important for me to have a wider variety of plants to work with, but everybody has their own unique style. You might prefer to go more of the one plant at a time, or maybe you're more of the few plants at a time, but again, just remember to take it easy and go slow into this. While you're in nature, start to learn about the plants that particularly pique your interest or kind of call out to you. Whether this be simply that it catches your attention through the senses, maybe you notice a plant that's got a bright yellow flower through a thicket, or maybe you smell its aroma, Maybe you brushed up against something and noticed a certain sensation, like a soft leaf or a little bit of a tingly sensation on your skin. Or maybe it's that you read about this organism and learned that it grows in your local ecosystem, and then perhaps you go out and seek that out specifically. Some of the best medicinal herbal finds that I've found within my own collection have simply come from my attention being drawn to a plant in the forest, and then over time developing that connection with that plant, firstly through just interacting one-on-one with the live plant, but then also through working with it as medicine. Once a plant has found your attention, identify the organism, whether it be that you're working with a guide. There's lots of foragers that are more than happy to provide services on plant walks or fungi walks where they point out different organisms to you. Or whether this be that you find it on an identification book or plant app, or ideally a combination of a few of these resources. When you begin to identify the organism, sit with it and observe. Consider interacting with the organism through kind of touch or through speaking to it softly, and begin to notice its direct surroundings. Notice how it interacts with other organisms. Perhaps there's a lot of pollinators that seem to come to this plant. Notice the direct needs that this plant might seem to have from its environment. Does it grow in really damp, muddy settings like Urtica dioica, nettles? Or perhaps it's growing off of the decay of another organism. Study the plant with your own senses initially, but also keep a trusty botanical identification book or a materia medica to read while you're learning about this organism. A materia medica is going to be basically a categorization of herbs and fungi that can be worked with as medicine. And a good materia medica dives into the many different traditions and common uses of those medicines. Once you have some notes from your identification book, or again, your materia medica, you can compare others' notes to what you're experiencing about the organism yourself. And then comes the kind of initiation phase between the organism. Once you've identified it, once you know for sure what this organism is, you can then begin to see how it interacts with your own body, your own mind. Start by working with a patch test. A patch test is incredibly important if you're new to an organism. In simple terms, a patch test is where you're applying a part of this organism to your body, to your skin, to see if your skin reacts in any kind of way. The common way to do this is to place a piece of the plant material or fungi in the crease of your arm where your elbow's at, also known as the cubital fossa, and let that sit by either pressing it into the skin or holding it there with your arm for around 5 to 10 minutes. I'd recommend closer to 10 if you have that kind of patience. And once you've taken that time to let that kind of sink in, you then are going to remove that piece of material and see if your skin has had any reactions. If you've got any kind of blistering, if you've got redness, if you've got irritation in general, cease from using that plant in general. There are, of course, exceptions here. We already mentioned Urtica dioica. Now, obviously, nettles is commonly known as stinging nettles, so that's going to cause redness on the skin. But it's a unique exception where you can work with the plant in its younger phase as medicine and as food. You can also dry Urtica dioica so that the constituents that cause that stinging basically become rendered ineffective. The next step in this process is going to be taking a piece of the material, crumpling it up into your hands, and cupping your hands over top of your nose and doing some deep breathing. So as you're doing this, it's not just a safety technique to make sure you're not going to react negatively to it, but it's also an opportunity to deepen your understanding and connection with the plant by smelling its biochemistry. Aromas from plants oftentimes come from volatile oils or from resins. After a lovely session of some deep breathing, you can begin to taste the plant or fungi. Now note, I did not say eat the plant or fungi. You take a piece of it, you're going to place it on your tongue, kind of let it sit there for a while, notice what you experience. And you might even consider chewing it up and kind of putting it between your gums as kind of like a chew to see over time how these constituents interact with your overall well-being. A lot can be learned from nature about its medicinal properties via taste. For instance, the sweet flavor, such as in the case of mountain hollyhock flowers or mullein flowers, Verbascum thapsus, oftentimes indicates a long-chain sugar constituent known as polysaccharides, which can have a nourishing, moistening, and cooling property on the body. Another example here would be something that's more bitter, where many of the bitters, which there's a ton of them in nature, can oftentimes help to stimulate saliva, bile, pancreatic enzymes, all kinds of digestive juices that help to break things down. But further, the bitter constituents oftentimes help to shift us into rest and digest, kind of indirectly by shifting our body into this breakdown process. Quick note on safety here, however, is that the bitter flavor, the reason our bodies begin to process things and kind of try to clear themselves out, is because our bodies evolved to understand the bitter flavor as potentially being a toxin. There are a lot of bitter constituents out there that are toxic, while there's also many bitter constituents that are medicinal. I find the more toxic ones oftentimes are a more deeper, acrid kind of bitter, such as in the case of dogbane. I've made the mistake of accidentally foraging dogbane thinking it was something else, and the flavor is so off-putting I couldn't even swallow. But even just a small amount of it ended up causing a massive headache. So be super, super extra careful. Pay attention to the flavors of what you're gathering from. After this initiation with the organism, this gives us an opportunity to then deepen our connection. If everything checks out, we didn't have any kind of reactions, we're feeling good, time for us to then deepen our understanding and connection with this organism. So this can be done through, again, just simply tasting. A lot of times what I'll like to do, especially with something kind of more tough like pine needles or fir needles, is I'll actually just take a bit of it, kind of chew on it, allow it to be like almost like a gum in a way. Just notice the flavors, notice what you're experiencing. Because again, flavor profiles here are going to be absolutely stellar for helping us to understand the chemistry of these plants without actually having to get into a chemistry lab. You could also consider doing things like learning how to propagate that species, perhaps directly in the field if you've got a great identification book that indicates the different ways that these plants spread. You could try to propagate it to your garden and then continue to further observe and experience that organism. But also this is the time where we can start learning to incorporate these different foods and medicines into our pantry, into our culinary settings, into our medicine making process, tincturing, oil usage, whatever it might be, and figure out how that plays out into our own lives with our own experience of the world around us. When you bring it home, continue doing more research. So you can look into scholarly articles, you can look into materia medicas, a variety of different resources is best. You've got herbal or culinary teachers as a resource as well. And also the internet just has a ton of different resources out there. The White Rabbit Institute is one of my favorites to go to for just a quick overview of a different plant. And you might consider learning about different ways that it's traditionally or spiritually used. You might learn the different ways that science has started incorporating these plants or fungi into our modern lives. You might also look into how to propagate these plants, or perhaps what kind of conditions produce different kinds of results for these plants. So for instance here, when I used to work for a lavender farm, with the lavender, if you allowed it to dry out for a day during the hot summer, the volatile constituents of lavender produced a stronger aroma, kind of like the plant was almost sweating in a way. And so this kind of information can help to guide you on when you want to go and forage for something. A lot of plants are best foraged in the early morning, just as the dew is beginning to run off of them. And this is especially the case when you're trying to forage for things like flower essences. And then ask yourself how the plant or fungi can be worked with to support those around you. How can you work with this organism to not only help with your family, your neighbors, your community, but also potentially the pollinators around you? Maybe propagation is the best route to go for foraging this plant. Speaking of which, that's going to be our next subject, which is returning the favor to nature. And my favorite way to do this is through propagation, basically foraging for propagation material of a native or naturalized species, rather than just for taking food or medicine from it. As foragers, we have a unique angle to really help to increase the abundance of whatever it is that we're gathering from. This should, of course, be done in a conscious manner where we're helping to propagate local native species, not invasive species. And also understanding ecological succession can be very helpful here for making more well-informed decisions on our process. So ecological succession, I'll dive into a whole episode on this, but just to sum it up, there's different phases where an ecosystem is going to be in that depend on what kind of species are going to thrive there the best and kind of which species are going to direct to the next stage of that ecological succession. For instance, pioneer species are oftentimes seen as weeds, or mosses a lot of times fall into the pioneer species category, where it's really initiating the rebuilding of an ecosystem. Intermediate phase, however, is going to be where you find a lot more like shrubs and more like perennial or biennial species. And then you've got the climax phase of ecological succession, where you're going to see full-blown forests, large evergreens, deciduous plants, that kind of thing. So you might consider planting pioneer or intermediate phase plants into areas that need reforestation, or perhaps places that have been overrun by spreading plants like rush skeleton weed, for instance. Some of our more competitive local native plants can really help to balance out that ecosystem and kind of fight back against the decline in biodiversity due to invasive species. And then another thing to be aware of is that when you're propagating, you want to be taking from multiple samples for your propagation to create genetic variability. So you're not just going to be gathering from one rose bush, for instance, but rather if you go to a place where there's multiple roses, you might try taking samples from multiple bushes. And then also, of course, it's incredibly important to consider the balance of other wild species in that area. Propagation shouldn't be human-centric. It should be egoless and help to serve the greater biome. So how do you propagate then? Well, just to go over a quick summary here on this episode, there's a few different main methods. The ones that I like to go for are seed propagation, which is oftentimes the simplest, basically just gathering seeds and helping to spread those. You can either do this literally in the field by chewing on some of those seeds to kind of nick them, to kind of scarify them, and then spitting them out into the soil. Or you can take them home and begin to cultivate them yourselves and then take them back out to their ecosystem. When you're gathering seeds, also be aware that you don't want to just take, because there are other animals that consume seeds, that consume berries, and also unironically help to spread these seeds as well. Another great way to do propagation is through stem or hip cutting propagation. So that's going to be where you're taking a small cutting of a stem or a branch, and you're going to help to produce more roots off of that cutting, basically cloning the initial plant. You're going to take that stem cutting and you're going to either put it into water or a lot of times propagate it directly into soil. You can use things like root hormones to help to cultivate this process, but this method of stem cutting is not necessarily as applicable to all plant varieties. Many temperate plants don't propagate through stem cuttings very easily, but there are some types of plants that tend to do really well here. Mint family plants such as Prunella vulgaris, woundwort, does really well just through water propagation, taking a cutting and then putting that into water for a couple weeks. Same with Mentha arvensis, does great there too. Vining plants are another great option here, where you've got things like many of the morning glory varieties or purple bindweed, Ipomea purpurea, that oftentimes are very easy to propagate as well. And then there's some plants that prefer to have their cuttings done while they're in the transitionary phase between kind of being a more softwood, a green material, into transitioning into kind of more of a woody material. Roses are a great example here, where many rose varieties, you want to cut them right when they're starting to turn into wood. Or even times there are plants that prefer just straight up hardwood cuttings as well. And then many of the Berbedaceae family, like barberry, Berberis vulgaris, and Oregon grape, Mahonia aquifolium, do great as hip cuttings. A hip cutting is basically where you're taking a stem cutting, but it's at the base of the plant. Obviously, not all plants have stems that kind of directly come out of the base like that, but there are examples where you can take that as well, and those plants generally do better with this type of propagation rather than with a stem cutting. A root cutting would be the next variation, where with root cuttings, it's exactly as it sounds. Things like Mahonia aquifolium do great here, where you're taking samples of this root and you're cutting them up into multiple pieces, planting them oftentimes in the wintertime, keeping them moist as the spring comes around, and then those will begin to clone into new plants as well. Black locust is another great option here, Robinia pseudoacacia, which is a great nitrogen fixer as well. And then something of a subsidiary of root cutting would be division. So division is basically going to be effective for plants that are rhizomatic, spreading, things like solidago, goldenrod, or uva ursi, bearberry, where with uva ursi, it spreads across the ground and you can literally just take a clump of it and put it into a new section of either the ground itself there or into a pot. And oftentimes it just continues to grow and spread from there. Ground cover like uva ursi is very easy to work with in this way. And then the last method I'll mention here, of course, there's tons of different methods, but the last one I'll mention here is layering propagation, which is another fairly common route to go, where basically you take a stem from the plant, you're going to push that down to the ground. You want this to be a semi-sturdy and hardy stem. You would kind of damage or nick the area of the stem where it touches the ground, and then you could even add on root hormone here as well. And then you're going to layer that down with a rock or some wood to hold that into the ground so that new roots will begin to form from where you nicked it. Once that has begun to form, you can divide that from the initial plant, and that will be a whole separate new plant there. There are many herbaceous plants that like to propagate in this kind of way, and I've actually liked to do this with Brachialia grandiflorum, where it grows down by the river over here in Spokane, and a lot of times I'll go down there, layer one of these stems down, and then come back to it later to divide that. So that way you're kind of propagating without actually having to take the plant out of its wild ecosystem. Some other ways to return the favor back to these plants and fungi is through direct cultivation. You might, for instance, be hiking in a forest and you come across an evergreen that has a whole bunch of dead branches hanging off the side of it, or nearly dead branches, and you might remove those so that, for one, that evergreen is not sending nutrients to places that aren't actually serving it, but also so that you can spread those branches around the soil, which are going to then feed the soil and the fungi and the bacteria and all the other organisms that live within that soil as well. While you're out hiking, you can also come across berry bushes and kind of chew on those seeds again, nicking them and then leaving those behind to spread those plants. You might remove stuck seed pods from the side of plants, such as in the case of the Rosa genus. Many roses will hang on to their seed pods for sometimes as much as 4 years, and those seeds end up just sitting there waiting to go to the soil. So you might remove some of those, spread those around, that kind of thing. You can also support pollination where applicable too. And then, of course, just directly when it comes to the soil itself, removal of toxins, if possible, is great here too. If you're out hiking, bring a trash bag, throw some stuff away. Encourage natural breakdown of certain plant materials. Also, frankly, peeing on the soil does help to add nitrogen to the soil as well. Certain plants along the lines of our more kind of like muddier environment plants really love this. And then for a more personal interaction, deepening that connection between yourself and perhaps an individual plant is to consider enriching the life of that plant, whether that be through natural substances such as natural compost or even dandelion tea, where you take the leaves of dandelion and steep those. That can help to feed the soil. Dandelion tea is very nitrogen rich, for instance. You might water a plant that's in a region that is experiencing a drought. Or you could consider localized mulch for plants that require more moisture retention, such as the Equestum family, horsetails. Plants and fungi also respond to sounds, vibration, where the sounds are going to interact with the root tips of plants and with the mycelium of fungi, which alters the chemistry of the mycelium and of the root tips, encouraging growth. And so you might consider bringing a small instrument or singing or talking with the plant, chanting, this kind of thing. Also consider doing some meditative breathing exercises near the plant as well, where you're keeping that plant in your heart, in your mind, and you're breathing in and out, providing carbon dioxide to the plant as the plant provides oxygen back to you. A direct symbiotic connection. Foraging offers us a direct link to our roots. It enriches our lives while enriching those around us. These nutrient-dense plants and fungi can be worked with as amazing food sources, offering support in difficult times or when other foods and medicines may not be otherwise as accessible to us, whether this be due to poverty, living remotely, disasters, or simply looking to enrich your palates with diverse nutrients and phytochemicals that support our minds and bodies. Next week, we'll discuss a bit about how foraging can serve those in need and why rediscovering the joy of natural foods can lead us to a greener future. If you have any questions for me, feel free to email me at theearthengrove@gmail.com. And as always, thank you for sticking with me. Have a beautiful, blessed rest of your day.